We're very excited to host this book launch for David. And just to give a brief introduction to him, David Robinson is a visiting scholar at the Social Science Matrix at the University of California, Berkeley, and a member of the faculty at the Apple University. From 2018 to 2021, he developed this book as a visiting scientist at Cornell's AI Policy and Practice Project. Earlier than that, Robinson co-founded and led Upturn, an incredible NGO that partners with civil rights organizations to advance equity and justice in the design, governance, and use of digital technology. We're also joined today by a very special guest who will be moderating this discussion with David. Professor Shannon Vallor is the Baillie Gifford Chair in the Ethics of Data and Artificial Intelligence at Edinburgh Futures Institute at the University of Edinburgh. She's also appointed in philosophy at the same institution, and her research explores how technologies, especially AI, robotics, and data science, reshape human moral character, habits, and practices. Her work includes advising policymakers and industry on the ethical design and use of AI. She's a fellow of the Alan Turing Institute and currently chairs Scotland's Data Delivery Group, and in 2015 received the World Technology Award in Ethics from the World Technology Network. She's a former visiting researcher and AI ethicist at Google, and in addition to her many articles and published educational modules, she's the author of the book Technology and the Virtues, a philosophical guide to a future worth wanting from Oxford University Press. She's the forthcoming book, Lessons from the AI Mirror, Rebuilding Our Humanity in an Age of Machine Thinking. We've got a really exciting discussion ahead of us today, which covers a lot of different topics around participation in design, around accountability, around healthcare and how healthcare is constructed and shaped in technological concepts. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to David to lead us through a brief introduction of his book.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and thank you everyone who's here this evening. Let's get right into it. Our story begins at this airport Marriott in Dallas, Texas on a chilly morning in February of 2007. The ballroom is full of doctors, data scientists, transplant surgeons, social workers, and some patients and living donors. What they're doing is publicly debating the algorithm that gives out kidneys for transplant in the United States. So just to be clear what we're talking about, people often talk about a waiting list for organs, but it's not actually a first come, first served queue. It's a matching process. So this is not a situation where you're giving an organ to a loved one, but rather if someone is an organ donor, their organs become available. There are 100,000 people waiting in the United States. And a federally authorized nonprofit called the United Network for Organ Sharing coordinates a national system whereby each organ that becomes available, there's a list of potential recipients for that organ that are prioritized based on medical factors like blood type and immunology, also logistics, who's nearby and who's ready, but also some moral factors like to what extent do we want to maximize the total amount of life that gets saved, which would mean basically picking recipients for whom the organs make a larger difference in terms of their lifespan versus giving people an equal chance. And that's really what's being debated in this room. There's a proposal on the table that the data scientists at UNOS and the surgeons, a committee of working group of experts has put together, and that is to maximize what is called lift. Now, this is obviously in the era before ride sharing. Lift means life years from transplant, and what you see on this slide is two different predictions. So the bottom zone there is if someone is 60 years old, an average 60-year-old who needs a transplant, and what percentage of the people like that, if we had a whole bunch of 60-year-olds and transplanted them, would still be alive however many years later is on the x-axis. So what you can see is that the teal line shows how many would survive on dialysis, and the yellow line with transplant. Dialysis, of course, is the filtering of the blood that you can have periodically if you don't have a working kidney. The main function of kidneys in the body, although not the only one, is to filter the blood. And so what you see here, because the area in this top area for the 20-year-olds is larger versus the area for the 60-year-olds. This is just a visual confirmation of something that you might predict, namely that if we give organs to younger recipients, on average, we'll save more additional years of life with the same supply of organs, which for the doctors in this room is very exciting, but not for the person who speaks after lunch, Clive Graw. He is a traffic engineer from Los Angeles. He's not there for his credentials, but rather because as a patient, he has a rare disease called polycystic kidney disease, or PKD, which means that his kidneys will break down over time. And what Clive points out is that for patients like him, it's good for everyone else if they delay when they need a transplant until they're as far along in life as possible by keeping themselves healthy and reducing the immediate demands. But if they do that under the system that's being proposed, this life years from transplant system, they'll be disadvantaged because they'll be older when they start to need a transplant. And he says using age for this and other reasons is unfair. Now, I should tell you, Clive's health was not good when he got up to give this presentation. They measure kidney health by something called the glomerular filtration rate, or GFR, which is 60 or above for most of us, for people with normal kidney health, 15 to 59 for people with kidney disease. And the point where you need a machine to clean your blood, you need dialysis if you have a low enough level, that's 15 and under. And he was at 16 the day he took to the stage to say that this plan that would give organs preferentially to younger and healthier recipients was unfair. Now, what happened to that plan? What happened to Clive himself? We will get back to that. But I want to give you a bit of the context here for how this remarkable room, this bringing together of many kinds of expertise and many kinds of people to make the moral choices inside of an algorithm, came about. And to do that, I'm going to take us a step back to 1960 or so, because the moral challenges in kidney medicine didn't begin with transplant. They actually began with dialysis, this process of cleaning the blood outside a person's body. Believe it or not, that technology was first used in World War II in Holland. So it had been around a long time, but there was a big problem with dialysis when people's kidneys would fail, which was that just like in injecting drug users run out of places in their body to access a vein and inject the drugs, the same problem happened for kidney patients who needed dialysis, which was that you could get into their body for about a month, but then you would run out of places to put this needle. Until in 1960, Belding Scribner, a physician in Washington State, invented what you see on the slide now, which is a flexible nonstick Teflon tube that could be left in a patient's arm. So this Teflon tube meant that you could dialyze someone over and over as many times as you needed to, which meant that people without working kidneys could be kept alive potentially for many years. So it was a huge breakthrough, but there was only one problem. Scribner only had 4 of these dialysis machines, and there were thousands of people around the United States who needed this treatment because they didn't have working kidneys. And so Scribner and the medical team were inundated with doctors and patients begging them to choose that patient to get to be kept alive by this new technique. But Scribner said, you know, as a doctor, I want to care for every patient. This ethical choice about which patients from among those who could benefit should get this scarce treatment, that's a question for a wider community. And so he actually went to the local medical society and had them put together a group. You see here the group in shadow. This is from Life magazine, 1962. Some things about this group: none of them are doctors, none of them are kidney patients. You can see there's one woman, third from left, and there's a priest whose clerical collar, second from left, is visible. So the group basically was largely in secret, except that Shana Alexandra, the author of this Life magazine article, was given access like an embedded journalist to this group and its deliberations. And, you know, it did not go over well. It was extremely ad hoc. They didn't have rules for who to give the treatment to, but really were making holistic or intuitional judgments. There was a pair of critics around this time who wrote in a law journal article that the Pacific Northwest is no place for a Henry David Thoreau with bad kidneys. In other words, this committee was going to reward male breadwinners with families to support and was not going to give the treatment to artists or nonconformists. So that, and for other reasons, there's a lot to dislike here, but there's also a lot to admire, or at least several things to admire, that became a template for the way that the later software algorithm would be made. Number one, the tech might be complex, but even when it is, the hard ethical choices belong to a wider community and not just to the data scientists. And by the way, secondly, in order to get the ethical input we need, we have to bring people into the fold to get them up to speed and educate them about the technology and its possibilities, which is what was done here. So flash forward to the present. We're heading back to Dallas now. There was a decade-long debate between 2004 and 2014 about how to remake the national matching software. And the first proposal, the one on the table in Dallas, was LIFT. Now, the baseline is this pink line that you're seeing. The proposed LIFT system is the teal line. And you can see this is showing you the fraction of all transplants that go to patients in each decade of life. In other words, under the existing system, 7% of the transplants happen for people in their 20s, but that would triple under the LIFT system. Why? Because younger patients who tend to be healthier can get more years of life out of the same organ on average than older patients can. Meanwhile, the share of transplants going to people in their 50s would fall by half. And this was something they showed in Dallas. And it really helped to catalyze criticism of this plan. The other thing I'll point out to you on the lower left corner of this graph is this image that shows the scientific registry of transplant recipients. That is a third-party auditing organization, an independent nonprofit with its own federal contract to analyze how the transplant system is going, who's getting organs, and how it's all working. And they do a thorough independent audit every year. Okay, so what happened with LIFT? It was unfair to seniors. It was the perception. It was also perceived as unfair to minorities because social determinants of health mean that minority groups have more comorbidities. So that was rejected. There was a second plan called the 2080 proposal, which basically said, okay, we hear you to the public that it shouldn't be the case that you have a much lower chance of getting an organ if you're older. So what if we keep everyone's chance of getting an organ by age about the same, but we reroute the healthiest and youngest kidneys to the healthiest and youngest recipients? And that way, even if everyone has the same chance of getting an organ at all, the total amount of benefit in the system can be increased. And then for the remaining kidneys, will use what's known as age matching, where kidneys from people in their 50s go to recipients in their 50s. That was ultimately found to be age discrimination and was rejected. We ended up with a messy compromise in the middle, which is this proposal, which I'm calling the final proposal because it was the end of this round of argument. But in fact, arguments over how this algorithm ought to work continue all the time. Now, why is this worth it for us to look at in the context of AI? There are all kinds of learned models here, forecasting how well an organ would do in one person versus in another person, forecasting how well someone would do on dialysis versus if transplanted. There's a lot of data science under the hood of this system. And just to give you some sense of how things looked, this is one example from one of those annual independent audits of the algorithm, showing that after the new system was introduced, this shows you the likelihood of being transplanted per amount of time for different racial groups. So if people of each race had an equal rate of transplantation, then those lines would be at the same point on the y-axis. And what you can see is that when the new system's introduced in 2014, there is indeed a convergence. That was partly due to a change in the way that waiting time was calculated, which we can get into if you want to. But I think the larger point here is detailed analysis that's easy to understand and looks at specific questions of interest is part of the infrastructure of what is produced. Okay, so why is any of this useful to us if we care about AI, if we're not already interested in what I would say is the fascinating world of kidney medicine, as I myself was not. I was not an expert on this, but I'd spent a lot of time in other settings like courtrooms and social services offices where software seemed to be going wrong and people were thinking about, I and others thinking about better ways to build and manage software that makes important moral choices. And what had we been saying? We'd been saying that systems should be transparent. We've been saying there should be public participation. We'd been saying there should be forecasting, or what are sometimes called impact statements. We've been saying there should be audits. Well, all of those were happening for decades in the transplant story. And so the question you might ask now is, where can we transplant this set of institutions and practices for running an algorithm in a relatively accountable way to new contexts? And I think I will give 3 factors that to me seem like places where it's likely that this is helpful. 1, cases that depend on public confidence in a system's competence and fairness. So organs are donated, people donate them if, but perhaps only if they think that the system is fair. But similarly in a courtroom, we need reason to know that software, if it's used at all, is going to be used in a way that is equitable, or in other public sector settings. Secondly, rationing problems where the resource that's being given out is public. So that could be kidneys, or it could be scarce seats in a public school. And thirdly, it might be useful, these lessons, I mean, in contexts where existing governance strategies don't seem to be working well, where we have software that's malfunctioning or behaving unaccountably or causing great concern. And then finally, and this is where I will conclude this whirlwind tour, is, okay, what are the lessons that we can learn from this about the general problem of governing high-stakes AI when it's making important moral choices? This story, I think, gives us 6 lessons, and I'm just going to briefly share those with you. Number 1, algorithms shift our moral attention. In other words, there were certain things that the design of the software made it easy to adjust. We could adjust the extent to which everyone got an equal shot versus benefits were maximized. And there was a big debate about that. There are a lot of other morally important facets of this situation that were not up for debate because the algorithm didn't, perhaps partly because the algorithm didn't make them easy to adjust. 1, there were arbitrary geographic catchment areas, so people get preferential access to organs within their own local zone. And some zones are much better supplied than others, so that's a big fairness problem. But also, I would point out, for example, that this whole argument was about how people get from the waiting list to actually being transplanted. It doesn't ask a related question, which is who's on that list in the first place. 2, participation creates opinions. You know, I often thought before working on this project about public input, almost like another mechanical ingredient to build, you know, as if finding out what lay people believe morally was a kind of measurement problem where we try to detect their opinions and act accordingly. What happened here was much messier and much more interesting, which was that over time, people argued against each other and gradually narrowed in on a set of possibilities that seemed, if not perfect, at least tolerable and better than the baseline. And I think one of the reminders for me in all of that is that governance, truly democratic governance, is messy. It does not mean that anyone gets everything they want. And getting to a mutually tolerable compromise is itself no small feat in the context, I think, of our current political climate. 3, shared understanding needs shared infrastructure. In other words, the ability to understand what's at stake and what the possibilities really are does not just depend on mere disclosure of technical details that an expert can decipher. What you need if you want other people at the table is material that they can understand, plain language explanations, graphs that show you the aggregate effect. And they had this in this case. This was one example where that infrastructure was powerfully present. And so you didn't have to be a kidney expert in order to come up with a reasonably informed moral opinion about what ought to happen in this case. And that's because the experts who were working on this had the bandwidth and devoted the resources to make it clear for others what was at stake. 4, deliberation is costly and its details matter. So this process took 10 years, and there were many, many, many meetings and editorials and studies of different alternatives. And the extent to which deliberation gets you anywhere useful, I think, is partly dependent on how it is set up and the extent to which it's worth it depends on how much benefit you get out at the end. So in this case, there was a real step forward in terms of both what people thought in terms of the system's fairness and the total benefit that it achieved. But I don't think it's trivial or easy to say that people should always be asked to do a public participatory deliberation. I think actually the question of when this is worth it is a hard one, especially if we consider that the people whose input we might be most eager to have, or who we might be most eager to include in the deliberation, may be precisely those with the least resources to devote to the participation process. And if so, in some cases, you see capture happening, as is the case, for instance, with land use in California, where the point of community input was that it was going to stop people from willy-nilly putting highways through poor neighborhoods, which perhaps it did, but it also gave rich homeowners a way to prevent a lot of development from happening. So that's, I think, getting the details right so that they really are inclusive is powerful. And that, I'm just discovering, is the lovely bells of Oxford in our background, because I happen to be in the UK. Okay, 2 more quick things. 1, quantification. Turning things into numbers can be a moral anesthetic. And in sort of science and technology studies circles, I would say the modal observation about this that I've seen is that it's bad. It sort of takes us away from appreciating the moral substance of what we're really doing, which I think is one way to look at it. However, like regular anesthesia, I think the anesthesia of quantification can also play a constructive role. I mean, I once heard it said in the context of a discussion about empathy, you really don't want a surgeon who feels your pain, right? You want a surgeon whose attention is completely focused on the surgery. And in a similar way, I think that in order to allocate a life-saving resource where some will get it and others will die, we have to navigate a world in which we can't fully achieve our values. And here I'm drawing on Calabresi and Bobbitt and the idea of tragic choices, as they put it, which is to say, peeling back that curtain and getting into the details about the moral pain that and the human pain that is behind a quantified system, I think is a choice, and we have limited amounts of capacity for that as human beings. And so when we devote ourselves to that kind of exploration, again, we have to choose carefully when is it worth our attention to do that. And lastly, and this was also a useful thing for me to take out personally, was that even when you have shared understanding and you have a great participatory process, the reality is that all of whatever we create to govern AI will be subsidiary to existing power structures. National legislatures, courts, the executive may come in and disrupt things that have been painstakingly multi-stakeholder-wise configured. In this case, for instance, shortly after the new algorithm was implemented, a court found that the arbitrary geographic catchment areas that I mentioned had been against the law all along because they were arbitrary and unjustified, and they were very swiftly removed. Instead of 10 years, it was a week in court to get them erased. So again, I think we see here the value of participation and the other governance methods for high stakes AI that's morally sensitive. We see that it can work. And we also, I think, get to some degree a somewhat sobering, somewhat measured sense of what it even means for a process to work, which is to say that in the best case, it's a hot mess that's tolerable, and we muddle and we muddle. Ideally, we muddle forward and towards something more fair, and that's where I'll leave us.
Thanks, David. This is just an absolutely fantastic piece of work. It was a pleasure to read the book, and I really advise those in the audience who've heard this presentation to dive deeper into the details of the text itself, which is incredibly rich. And I think it's a really remarkable example of a book that serves very well actually as an introduction to the challenges of technology ethics more broadly and technology governance more broadly, of algorithmic governance specifically. But in addition to providing, a very thorough account of the scholarly and kind of historical context of these challenges, it also confronts those hard realities that might not align with our expectations or our ideals about how, in a perfect world, we'd want algorithmic governance or democratic participation in this context to work. So I just commend you for a really remarkable and novel set of insights into this. I want to bring around the question of public participation, and when we do have good reason to get into a deliberative process as part of algorithmic governance, and when we do want the public stakeholders to play a role and have agency in that. And I think later we can come to that question you raised about, when we can afford that, or when it makes sense to pay the costs associated with that kind of investment in deliberation. But let's say for the cases where we need that, where that's either warranted or morally obligatory, how do we make it easier? What can be done to lower the barriers to this kind of participation, or what did you learn about that in your study of this particular case? You talked about in the book about the kinds of infrastructure, as you mentioned, that are needed to facilitate this. Can you tell us more about the specific kinds of infrastructure that we might look forward to building, to making these kinds of engagements a reality?
Yeah, I think there basically are two kinds, and I think of infrastructure that are important, seem to me from this experience important for participation, one of which they really have in spades in the context of transplant, and the other, honestly, they don't. The one that they, I think, relatively do have is this sense of shared data analysis capacity, so that something is created that you don't have to be an expert in order to understand. And I want to be candid about the limits of that as well as I see them, which is that in the end, whoever does the analysis and decides which graphs to make and sort of how to frame the assessment exercises enormous influence over how the public is going to understand the possibilities and what the terms of the debate are going to be. And that, I think, is one reason why something that a lot of people have argued for, which is sort of third-party auditing or analysis. I actually think the logic of that, which is that you want an independent perspective, applies even before there's a fielded system out there to audit, and really also is those same worries are a good reason to have a third party that does your sort of prospective data analysis. And I know impact statement is a popular term for that forecasting. I like the word forecasting because to me it has always seemed impact statement seems like it's just from the language sounds retrospective. So I find it forecast less confusing. But in any event, I think that data analysis, even though you're taking a risk when you let somebody do that, and you can still release all the details so that someone else is allowed, if they are resourced and wish to do their own separate analysis. And that happened here too. There were teams of people arguing back and forth and about how the system should work. So I think that kind of plain language with, it's a lot of expertise and a bit of humility to get you there. Then the other piece, which is one where I think they have less to show us in the transplant world, is just the raw mechanics of participating. When are the meetings? Who's there? How do you get there? Who even knows that the meeting is occurring? I think of things like in sort of a participatory context that's a little bit different. So, for example, participatory budgeting in Brazil, which is that's where it originated. It now happens elsewhere as well, but the community sort of votes on local improvements and spends part of its public budget through this deliberative process. And they found that providing dinner if they're asking people to come at the dinner hour, and providing childcare if parents and especially mothers are among those they hope to include, are really, really catalytic. And I do think, even though the views of outsiders in the case I study in the book got us to an algorithm that was very different from what experts alone would have produced. And we know that because the experts gave us lift as their first idea, and we ended up somewhere very different. So in that sense, public participation made a real difference. On the other hand, I think it was pretty much, it was who knew about it and who participated was pretty limited. Like many of the patients who weighed in, their doctors happened to be involved in the policymaking process. Or, even if anybody on dialysis, they spend hours and hours, each week thinking about kidneys and transplants. So there's kind of this built-in mind share piece where there's just like a lot of attention from the stakeholders that might not be true if, you're a busy, person who's receiving public assistance. You're dealing with the problems that justify your need for assistance rather than going to meetings about how the assistance should be allocated, presumably. So that's a challenge.
That's great. Before I follow up on that, I just want to encourage those in the audience to begin entering questions. I see we have a question already in the Q&A. Please add more. We'll around the turn of the hour, we'll come to those questions and take you through them. So, but before we move to an entirely different question, though, I want to follow up on an implication of what you've been talking about, which is that there is this trade-off between the kind of expertise, third-party expertise that might take a high-level view of the system, that might have a certain kind of detachment, versus the participants for whom the stakes are potentially life and death, or otherwise very grave, and that the participants themselves are, in most cases, not going to be perfectly representative of the community of persons and groups who might deserve a voice. And so I think I'm curious your thoughts on this. What factors should we use to decide whether the decision-making power ultimately is best concentrated in the hands of those who have expertise and technical knowledge, but not the sort of lived experiences of what's at stake, perhaps, that others do, versus going to participants who are acutely affected by what's at stake for them, but who themselves, might distort the interests at play by being the ones who showed up, being the ones who had the confidence or the interest or who trusted the system enough to bother to engage in the first place. Do you have any sort of thoughts on how we can kind of make sure that we're not giving ourselves an illusion of fairness and an illusion of inclusion when we have somebody, participating who's just a very kind of loud and vocal and passionate voice on the issue, but they might not represent everyone else who's affected? Yeah,
this is a really good question. And if we sort of begin with the end in mind, I mean, what we're hoping to end up with is in this case and in analogous cases, is a system that both reflects the expertise of what it is possible to build and also reflects the values and experiences of impacted people. Somehow or other, if we end up happy at the end of the day, it's going to mean that those different elements got integrated. And so I think there's sort of no escape from collaboration in order to have things go well in cases of this sort. Still, though, you're absolutely right that if we open it up and say anyone is welcome, or any patient or any program recipient is welcome, we're not going to get a representative sample. There are many different techniques for involving people. If we're talking about something where there's we think a lot of bandwidth going into the participation would be justified, like citizen juries, for example, like what happened in Ireland with the abortion policy change, or Iceland's deliberation on its potential new constitution, are one example. Helen Landemore has a wonderful book about a variety of these sort of other ways of doing democracy besides just voting. And her role, her term for this kind of whoever shows up story is spatially inclusive. It's like, we're going to make a space and whoever comes into it can weigh in. I think there's value in that, but I also would say that any finite set of people deliberating is going to have other people outside of it who in some way, I mean, we're all connected in the end and we all impact each other. And there's always going to be people out there who, on the one hand, are tied in the web of causality with what's happening, and on the other are not in, the single conference room where the meeting is happening. And so I hear and I share that anxiety about not having just, treating whoever shows up as a perfect avatar for everybody else. But I also don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the incrementally improved. If by doing more to bring in more impacted voices, we can get to a place that's better than where we are now, which I would submit that in many cases of the kinds of systems that we worry about, we can do. But I think, at the margin, outreach to the impacted communities that's more systematic is one big piece. So disciplined investments in sharing knowledge and inviting people in and figuring out what works for them, some of which might be not just money spent on, but like changes to practice to make it easier for people to plug in. But also, I think there is a sense of there's a when do we have direct versus proxied participation? So sometimes people are represented by NGOs of like patient advocacy groups or others. And I think, when that kind of organized representation is available, that's another tool, again, not a perfect tool, but another resource that can be tapped into to try and get a more inclusive conversation.
That's great. I want to take forward this notion of the integration that you're calling for between the technical or subject matter expertise and the knowledge and lived experiences and values of those who are most impacted. A key theme of the book is accountability. And the need to make algorithmic systems reflect the moral concerns of those impacted by them. So, I've been thinking about this a lot in some of my own work about the extent to which accountability really means answerability. and the ability not just to be assigned, as the person who will pay for the harm, or the person who will make the decision, but the person who will respond to what's at stake for the other. And there's an element of recognition, right, in accountability. So I was just curious, did you see this play out at all in the interactions between the specialists and clinicians and transplant coordinators and the patients and other advocates for various kinds of parties? Did you see much? Was it mostly just sort of sharing of knowledge, or were there moments where you saw this kind of recognition happening, where you have someone who might have a kind of bureaucratic or scientific detachment from a certain level of this, and suddenly they are acknowledging and responding to the kind of raw fear or emotion or grief or something else that's really being expressed as a deep moral concern to them?
This is a good question. What it's reminding me of, and I'm not sure whether this is an exact response, but one of the things that I got to do was to interact with some surgeons who work on this. And one in particular, an interlocutor in the book, is Goran Klintmalm, who was really was one of the pioneers, trained under Starzl, who was the first person to do liver transplants. And he, anyway, Klintmalm started the transplant program at Baylor in Texas, which is a big program now. And one of the persistent problems that they had was that while the need for kidneys is concentrated in the African-American community, largely because there are social determinants of health like diabetes and high blood pressure, so there's that are much more common, and then those things in turn tend to lead to kidney failure. But and because minority so there's more, it's more likely if someone is a person of color that their blood type is B than if they're a white American. And at this time they weren't doing transplants across blood types. They actually began to do that as part of the system I studied. But anyway, so there was much more demand, but not radically more supply in the Black community of donation. And so there was a whole years-long thing where Klintmalm would go with kidney donors from that community to churches and other community groups to sort of really to share the experience of donation, and recipients would be there whose lives really had been saved. That's a whole other issue. I mentioned who gets onto the list. So people with less education, less access to care can have dialysis because that's federally funded, but they don't get often told that they are a good candidate for transplant. So they may not even get on to this list where we're wanting to treat all the list members fairly. And in fact, the overall process is, I think there's a fairness issue with how we think about people as prospective recipients. So for example, the transplant centers can be punished if their failure rates, go above a few percent. One surgeon told me I can't be a 95% surgeon in a 97% world, or they would shut me down. So then it turns out we'll pay for dialysis. This is a very, I guess, foreign concern from the point of view of the National Health Service, or be covered by that. But the federal government pays for dialysis as long as you need an immunosuppression, which is what you need after transplant, for 3 years only. So basically, the transplant centers end up being forced to say, or end up saying, if we transplant someone who might not have financial means for private health insurance, and which is often that's going to be a person of color, then we're going to get a higher failure rate because they won't be able to afford these drugs, and we might get shut down. And so I think part of the dignity process, to get back to your question about when is there this acknowledgement, there's a push now to both to cover more of those immunosuppressive drugs, but also to pull back the curtain on this process where these kind of impressionistic judgments about who's a good patient are being secretly made by individual hospital screening committees, led, I should hasten to emphasize, by African-American women who are physicians and are in this process. And I would say that, so that kind of representation and that kind of looking beyond the numbers, what's happening here community-wise that isn't in our data set. So one example, just a simple example, was that people believe in one transplant center that someone isn't a good candidate if they can't afford the $20 parking in the parking lot consistently, if they would have to take public transit and therefore in the event of a missed bus would miss, some appointment. That's a higher risk. And we react to that today, by excluding people from the pool of potential recipients, when what the transplant surgeon who was explaining this to me argued, we really ought to be giving out bus passes. Like, hello, this is a soluble problem, or Uber, whatever it is, right? There's always a way to move things forward. But I think that kind of broader vision, which I would say more on the physician side, perhaps, than on the data science side, is really important.
So I want to switch gears now and talk a little bit about the conclusions that you drew at the end of the book about how participation shapes the opinions, or as you said, even just creates opinions that weren't there before. And I really love that critique of the notion of stakeholder input, right? As if there's sort of just another kind of data to feed into the algorithm when you just, as you describe, something very different is happening. But in addition to the process and the participation shaping people's opinions, did you find that it shapes the people? I mean, how do they change over a lengthy engagement like this? Their capabilities or their attitudes about democracy and cooperation and deliberation itself, or their abilities and their kind of democratic virtues. Did you see sort of changes in people and their capabilities or their dispositions that maybe would give us other reasons to make this kind of process more readily embraced and invested in?
I think so. And this is a great point. And it harkens to some of your work on moral upskilling, this idea that by doing virtue, we cultivate virtue, which is one that I'm very much in sympathy with. You have, also democratic theorists like my Apple colleague, Josh Cohen, who've written about how this idea that democracy is a thing we learn by doing. And so in addition to, I guess, being a virtue, it's a kind of skill. And I think that's true. That is certainly true here. And and part of it too, I don't, did I get to know any of my interview subjects deeply enough that I would feel comfortable characterizing whether their dispositions had changed over this process? I'm chagrined to say that I feel like I'd be out on a very thin limb if I tried to do that. But what I will say is that I think their sense of what this process was, if somebody spent a long time in it, you could kind of tell that they had become bound to the other participants, that there was a sense of mutual entanglement and mutual regard. And part of it, I think, is that if you've been flying to meetings for 10 years, even if what's on the table is not your first choice of outcome, at some point you say, I would rather have something good come of this, than kind of hold up the train for everything I want. And in order to get someone to that point, you have to get them to care about the other people and the kind of process as a thing. And so, it's interesting because I guess from an economic point of view, the economists will say that sunk costs are irrelevant to what you do next, that you shouldn't act differently now just because you worked hard on something before. But I think people do act differently now if they worked hard on something before. And that's a very important ingredient in what happened here, that people sort of at some levels came to feel that they owed it to each other to reach a compromise they all could live with. And they didn't enter the room owing that to each other, but somehow that mutual debt evolved out of their interactions.
Yeah, that's really fantastic sort of perspective. This idea that, you know, we kind of, you know, build democracy. We don't just kind of tear it down every day and start over again. That it's this kind of constant active construction and maintenance, right? And I think that perspective gets lost when we think about governance as just this sort of, here's a risk, what's the process to manage it, or to render it harmless. I want to close with one question before I turn to the audience and the questions that they have, which we've got some really good ones already in the chat. So my own last question for you is about how we take the lessons of this book forward to thinking about the governance of other kinds of systems, particularly AI-driven systems, with new regulation, or at least being outlined in the EU and also in the United States, the idea of a kind of AI Bill of Rights. What should we take from your book if we move forward with some of these initiatives to develop stronger guardrails and stronger political processes to govern these technologies?
Thank you for that question. That's a great question. And I think the number one thing is that those four areas of technique that I mentioned, and that many in our literature have extolled. So participation, transparency, you know, forecasting, auditing, these are not just ideas. I mean, they are ideas, but they are also actual practices that have been going on for a long time. And just because the people working on it in the context of organ transplant wouldn't brand themselves as AI practitioners, that doesn't mean they're really doing a different thing than what we care about. My pitch is they're really doing essentially a kindred thing of what we care about. And so I think from a policy perspective, being able to say, this is not just some notion on a whiteboard, this is a thing we've been doing a long time because we think it's right, and we know how. You know, and I should confess, so before going to Apple, I spent a month at the White House at OSTP working on the AI Bill of Rights. And, you know, the way I read the document that became public is that it's doing really, really two things, which I think are both important, especially in the multi-sectoral kind of US context where we don't have a kind of overall omni regime. Is they're saying, number one, these techniques really work, and it calls for some of the same techniques, perhaps not totally coincidentally, that I, you know, have been studying. But you have, so those techniques really have been used, are feasible. And of course, the other thing it says coming from the White House is we think these are good ideas in general. And so I would see that as something that policymakers at many different levels, in many different institutional postures, you know, could adopt. Like, I think one thing I often think about is a city council person where there's some AI vendor pitching a new police tool that's going to tell you who the dangerous or the violent people are. And what we really need is for city council people in that situation, when it arises, to ask some really pointed questions. And I think lay people, you know, tends to be that political leaders often have humanities backgrounds and they feel intimidated by the idea of asking, you know, where do those numbers come from? How would you know if this thing were working or not? You know, what are you really measuring? You know, those kinds of basic questions. I think we need to embolden people to ask them and to expect answers. And a big part of that is the cultural question of whose onus it is to be understanding what's going on. So it's not that the general decision maker, you know, this kind of don't worry your pretty little head about it, the experts understand this. No, the decision makers need to understand it, the communities need to understand it. And that means a kind of sharing. And I would say that in particular with respect to public sector applications. So that's where I think we at least need to be doing this, and hopefully can learn about, how to do it by doing it, just like the subjects in the book in some way did.
That's great. Thanks, David. There's a ton of fantastic questions in the chat and the Q&A. If you can put them in the Q&A, great. But I see that some people are adding some questions in the chat too, so I'll try to look at both. Let me start with a question that Alex Voss has asked. So Alex is asking, do you work to introduce different ways of thinking about ethics? So I suppose one way of interpreting this question, and hopefully I'm not misrepresenting what Alex intends here, but you talked about the different kinds of values that might be entered into this kind of deliberation. And certainly there will be conflicting notions, right? Someone who has a kind of perhaps more utilitarian orientation may see things very differently than someone who's kind of focused on some kind of intrinsic dignity or intrinsic value of a life, or someone else who's really focused on a kind of justice lens. So do you have any thoughts on, as we kind of see these different value orientations or different ethical attitudes bumping into each other in the deliberative process, how does that sort itself out?
Yeah, so one thing that was really tricky about this case was that if you liked Lyft, if you liked the sort of utilitarian, we had a definition of utility as life years saved. Actually, that buried some values judgments. For example, basically they said that a life year spent on dialysis was worth 0.8 of the life years spent enjoying a transplant. In other words, which had the effect of prioritizing people who would have had a long survival on transplant by saying you're actually going to gain 0.2 years of life for every year in which you would have been alive either way, right? So those sorts, that's a values judgment. But also there's something very quantitative about the way that utilitarian approaches sort of characterize their aims. Whereas on the other side, equity, it's kind of a soup of what exactly we would mean or what exactly we would want to say. And there's a sense of giving everyone an equal chance, but not always a total clear sense about what the equal chance needs to be. So for example, one way of looking at it would be to say, well, people of all ages who begin to need transplants should, as of that moment, have an equal chance of ultimately receiving a transplant. But then you think, wait a minute, some people have lived a long and full life already. Others have, God willing, most of their life in front of them still. And so there's what's known as a fair innings argument. And I know this will be, from a bioethics point of view, familiar, but for those not, kind of seeped in this, I mean, the idea being, if you haven't had a chance to live a life yet, then it is in some way more morally urgent for you to be saved than for somebody who's in the late afternoon of their years to get the same number of additional years of survival, right? And the reason that this is material is because it comes apart from the utilitarian idea that 10 years of life saved is 10 years of life saved. This says, no, 10 years of life for a young person may have more value than 10 years of life for a retiree. That's just one illustrative example of a way you could sort of take apart the idea of equity and come up with something that is different from this kind of raw numbers utilitarianism, which again, with that dialysis factor isn't even really raw. It actually bakes in some holistic values judgment that didn't come from the numbers. But, I think in a data science world, accounts of what morality requires that are themselves essentially quantitative do enjoy a kind of advantage over the kinds of considerations that and I think, you, Shannon, and perhaps many in the audience, may be attracted to things about virtue or about, developing our human capacities. Those don't try to be measurable in the same way that utilitarian moral claims try to be measurable. And so you do end up with, as the cover was showing, that I'm thinking about that transplant journal cover with the apple and the orange, and you have apples and oranges, but you don't really have, as that image did, a scale on which to weigh the apple against the orange. That's kind of the point. That's what makes it an orange. It doesn't have a defined weight. All of which is to say that so okay, what does that mean for practice? I'm going to just try and push myself a little bit here to be. I think one thing this means is that the way those other moral ideas enter is by potentially exercising influence over the scope of quantification. So in other words, you're saying, okay, no, there's some value judgments here that are not to be made quantitatively. I don't think that virtue theorists and others, or people interested in dignity, or people interested in recognition, these other kinds of, I don't think that we, and I'll venture to put myself there because that is part of my leaning, need to be embarrassed about the fact that our moral view is not an essentially quantitative view. I think the question of to what extent should this be a matter of measuring out and enumerating the moral logic, that itself is open to moral contestation.
Yeah, I think that's so important. The value of this moral contestation and not seeing that as a kind of undesirable friction to push out of the system for reasons that you detail in the book quite well. But yeah, we've all sort of seen this temptation to sort of say, well, look, there's these differing views that come from these very kind of fuzzy and imprecise and unquantifiable moral perspectives. So we'll just kind of decide that those are a wash, right? That they somehow cancel each other out because they're all impossible to assign a definite value. And then we'll just go back to our kind of utilitarian or quantitative perspective. So I appreciate the defense of the need to kind of take those perspectives and give them the weight that they're due. There's another question here that I think is really important to talk further about, which is whether there were discussions in the context of the algorithm about accountability for errors, accountability for incorrect outcomes. So this comes from Kevin Keith. Was there or is there a need for an overarching decision-making or governance process that provides that kind of accountability for outcomes that ultimately, come out as a mistake or an error?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And actually, just as the book was being released, there was a major investigation, a congressional investigation into the operations of this software system, which found all kinds of potential difficulties, including that the system is sometimes down when people need it, and that certain data that are used in allocation decisions are manually entered by clinicians into the UNOS computer system. And whenever there's manual entry, there's an entry point not only for data, but also for error. And there have been errors that have been at times material. And so that's a real struggle. And the United Network for Organ Sharing, which is the only entity ever to have run this system, faces little competitive pressure because of its entrenched, I think, position. And that's been a source of consternation to legislators for years. UNOS even asserts that the code whose decision logic is public, but the source code itself, they say, is copyright to them and not something that they should have to share with anyone else if, for example, the government wanted to transfer the responsibilities to some other party unless they're paid for it. So that is a whole separate mess. And so one thing that does, to respond directly to the questioner, is it validates the idea that errors are a problem that needs to be thought about, irrespective of how the system gets built. And I also think, though, one of the remedies for those errors that has been proposed is that a separate contract for designing the system be given, and then a separate, like a commercial entity, could come in and operate according to the designs of the designers. But I worry that something important could be lost if design and operation were separated, namely that the people involved in these deliberations over what to build were the world's most informed folks about what could be built. In other words, for example, what clinical data fields do they have? How could they use those? I think if you separate out those functions, then it'd be like trying to manipulate this delicate system wearing thick gloves, where you just aren't going to have the same degree of deep immersion in the way it works and kind of what it can do and what it can't. And so I think having the fact that practitioners who are helping build the system were also in these debates was good.
Mm-hmm. Great. We've got a question that comes back to a point in the book that I also was just really taken with, and I'm still thinking about, and that's this point that you made about moral anesthesia and tragic choices. And Andrew Strait has asked a question about this that I think is worth diving into. Can you say more about what you think qualifies as a tragic choice and who gets to frame a choice as tragic in this way? So Andrew says, I'm conscious that many technology developers would like to think of themselves as surgeons addressing a very specific concrete issue that their expertise is sufficient for, and that they, implicitly believe they have the legitimate backing of the publics or communities they're serving. And Andrew says, I worry that's rarely the case, and this can be a way to discount lived experience or the limits of expert knowledge and shift the moral burden of these choices. So, so moral anesthesia, let's say we agree that there are times when that kind of anesthesia is necessary, but there's always a temptation to anesthetize too quickly, avoid the trouble, right, of grappling with these kinds of conflicts. So how do we decide when moral anesthesia, i.e. the kind of quantification of the problem is warranted, and who ought to have that power?
Yeah, these are good questions, and I think that Andrew, you're right that many technology developers want to think of themselves as these surgeons by analogy. I also think, though, that a complicating factor here is that it's not only the surgeon, it's not only the technology developers being willing to sort of appoint themselves surgeon, it's also the case that everybody else is uncomfortable grappling openly and directly with these tragic choices, which mean we're going to violate values, commitments we hold dear, no matter what we do. You can only save one of these two people. They're innocent. Neither of them deserves to die. Paralyzed by inaction, you save neither. Save one, you lose the other. The other didn't deserve to die. Well, a situation like that, say Calabresi and Bobbitt in this 1970s book, the Tragic Choices book, they say, look, we're doing violence to our values in that situation, whichever way we go. That's what makes the choice tragic. But then the question is, so who should decide what to do in that situation? And also, as you say, when do we or don't we peel back the curtain? I think one of the things is, so if you look at the federal statute that governs organ allocation, what Congress has said is that organs should be allocated based on medical criteria. So they're kind of passing this hot potato of moral judgment and saying, why don't we come up with some neutral expert reason? And in fact, as you'll know from the book, but for those who haven't, one of the things for many years that doctors wanted to do was use these tiny differences in immune system orientation between people as a reason, a neutral clinical reason to say this person should get the organ and that one shouldn't, even when the evidence that those immune system differences would make a difference to how long the transplant would succeed, even when that evidence was weak, there was this desire to latch on to this clinical detail and not have to face the choice as a moral choice. And so, where before my inner picture before this work was something like technologists grabbing the moral microphone and like I'm, pretending something's technical so they can be the ones to decide the moral logic for the rest of us. There's a flip side, which is that it is very human of us, the rest of us, non-technology, people outside that circle with respect to some system. There's a natural impulse for us to abdicate our role of making these moral choices. And so I think you have to bring people in and kind of create a culture where everyone agrees that this is something that a community needs to face. And maybe part of that is constituting a community. So you create a sense of people being bound together that might not have existed there to begin with, just so that people will treat each other as kind of owing something to each other. And then Calabresi and Bobbitt said we should peel back the curtain only when peeling back the curtain can get us to a place that everyone would agree is better than where we are now. So in this case, for instance, they might say, look, it would have been great if it were faster, but still, we got to save more life and do something that people regard as more fair. That's pretty good, probably.
Yeah, something you just said makes me think, you talk about the way that this kind of community formation can help address this. And one thing I think, maybe it also does is help share the weight or distribute the weight of these moral choices, right? That if I don't see myself as the one who's ultimately alone in making this kind of, very painful decision for another, if I see, this as a responsibility that is collectively being held and executed, maybe it's a little easier for us to bear. I think we have time for at least one more question, maybe two, but there's
Can I break in just for one thing? There's a question here I want to make sure not to miss that sounds technical, but is really I want to make sure we get this. Ushnish Sengupta has asked, was there explicit recognition among the physicians that I met about the discrimination involving EGFR? So EGFR, as I mentioned, just to bring everyone onto the same page, was this numerical estimate of how well your kidneys work. And it has to be below a certain threshold in order for you to qualify for a transplant. And in that formula, at the time in 2004 to 2014, there's a checkbox for whether you're African-American or not. And if that box is checked, i.e. if the person is classified as African-American, then points are added to their score. So in other words, they're treated as having better kidneys, which might sound good until you realize that the better your kidney function is, the less access you have to transplant. So in effect, it was removing access by an explicit race factor for African-American patients. So a terrible thing with murky and hard to account for origins in the development of this formula. Only this summer, 2022, did they remove that factor from a revised formula. It was not widely discussed during the 2004 to 2014 period that I studied. There is one footnote in my book about this issue, which if I had the book to write over, knowing what I do now, it would be 2 or 3 pages in the book about that. But I think, maybe again, it's kind of like you get a debate going, it has a structure, certain questions are on stage and other questions, very important ones, inevitably are somehow not on stage. And this was one of those.
Great. Thank you for picking up that point. There's one more, at least in the chat or in the Q&A that I would like to pick up, and that's a question from Catherine Waite. So she's asking about other contexts in which algorithmic decision-making and participation might be brought to bear. For example, asylum claims in the UK. And we know, for example, that algorithmic decision systems are being used, for example, in Canada and a number of other places to make decisions or support decisions regarding immigration and asylum. So Catherine says, to my mind, this would be a strong case for public participation. However, whether politically this would be sought as key, i.e. would this be seen as creating division? And what Catherine's question makes me think about is one of the kind of bigger problems, right, with democracy is sometimes the kind of democratic process, especially if we're just talking about sort of simple democracy, can lead to majoritarian injustice as a result of people banding together against, minoritized, for example, or vulnerable populations. So thinking about public participation, right? If you bring that in a very polarized political environment into decisions about the algorithms governing asylum claims or immigration, that could be a process that leads to dangers that you wouldn't see in your case study, right? How should we think about this kind of, when is democracy safe to bring into these processes?
Yeah, this is a good question, and I don't have a complete answer. It's an interesting example. I'm thinking of there's a piece of literature about deliberation and whether deliberation sort of polarizes or moderates people, in which the actual experiment, and I think this was in Scandinavia, was having small groups deliberate about asylum policy, where the groups were deliberately composed half and half of people who were strong permissivists and strong restrictionists with respect to the granting of asylum claims. And in that context, at least, what it found was that in a small group discussion setting, there was convergence rather than further polarization that tended to happen. And that sort of, I think, points me toward the unsatisfying partial answer that I want to give here, which is that the scale of deliberation is a really important factor. So if you have a group, like take this Irish abortion case as an example of something, obviously many people have strongly held, passionately held views that are very different from one another. A giant national referendum that you just go straight to the question is one possible thing. What they did was very different. They had a small group, a representative group across the country, get together on a sustained basis repeatedly, get to know each other, and not only to see each other as kind of robots holding particular points of view, but really get to know each other at a human level. And I think that, so I think when you're able, as much as we don't want to be exclusionary and we want inclusiveness of different perspectives, I actually think a human scale community where the players know each other over time and have these kind of reciprocating, sustained interactions with each other is also very important. And maybe that points towards some kind of representativeness, which is to say you can't have everyone in the same small community or it won't be a small community anymore. And so you have to kind of create a human scale one way or another.
That's really thoughtful, and I want to close. Maybe we've not got time, but I for further questions. But I just want to ask you if you have any last thoughts that you want to share with the audience, or maybe a single point that you hope that they take from the conversation today.
Well, thank you, and I first of all thank you to all to you, Shannon, and to all of the questioners, and to Ada Lovelace Institute for giving us the infrastructure that makes this conversation possible. It's all been very thoughtful, and I'm very glad. I myself, before this project, did a lot of critiquing and a lot of, one might say, admiring the problem of algorithmic bias and the ways that AI can go wrong. And as we've been discussing, the transplant case is far from perfect as a way of governing an algorithm. Nonetheless, I think that it is important to take a practical approach and important to try and get into the details of the systems we live in and the systems we've built and make them better, even if it can sometimes be more comfortable either to say things are great or we should tear it all down and start over. Ultimately, the person who says the status quo is fine and the person who says we should tear it all down and start over are agreed that it is not time to roll up our sleeves and incrementally improve the messy details of the systems we've actually got. And, my greatest hope, I think, for this book and for our collective conversation going forward is, can we make a bit of a pivot in which we make some more space for the hard, pragmatic, imperfect work of improving the systems that we've got in concrete ways.
Thanks, David. I desperately share that hope with you. I also want to thank Ada Lovelace Institute and Andrew and the team who've supported us for enabling us to have this conversation. Thanks to the audience for coming and sharing with us your really insightful questions, which have deepened the discussion. And I'll turn it back over to Andrew to close us out.
Thanks so much, Shannon. And thank you so much, David. That was a really fantastic conversation. I feel like I've got lots to think about, lots for us to discuss as a team, and I'm sure everyone here is left with some really brilliant, fantastic points to ponder over for the months, weeks ahead. Thank you both so much again for joining us, and thanks all of the participants and individuals who joined us today. We really appreciate you joining us late on a Wednesday evening for this fascinating discussion. Have a lovely rest of the week, and thanks again. Take care, everyone.